Let me just briefly introduce Carl because Carl I met through my PhD, and we are both studying together with the Royal College of Art. And Carl and I spoke at length a while back about his research, and it is just incredibly interesting, the questions that he is posing within his research. And I really, really wanted Carl to come today and talk to you guys about some of the questions that his research poses, because I think every single student online at the moment with us is very aware of the need to kind of think about diversity, but also this concept that Carl's going to introduce you to today with regards to decolonizing advertising. So I would highly encourage all of you to make notes on the lecture. And if you have any questions, please use the chat function on the side to ask any questions, and we'll pose those to Carl at the end of his talk. So Carl, I'd love to hand it over to you now, and welcome and thank you so much for joining us, because I know you're joining us all the way from Mexico.
Yes, it's early in the morning here. It's 10 o'clock. I guess it's 5 o'clock there. So I'm going to now share my screen. So thank you very much for inviting me, Plymouth College of Art. And today, what I'm going to talk about are my research projects that I've done in Mexico. And I'm going to sort of do it through the lens of how I'm involving the community while I'm trying to decolonize advertising. But first of all, let me sort of explain who am I. I come from an advertising background, and I'm an art director, and also I do art. And also now I'm teaching advertising in London. And so I define myself in those three areas. And I'm a Welsh. I was born in Wales. I know I don't sound Welsh now because my family moved to Canada, and I finished high school there, and then I studied art direction. And then I moved to Mexico to become a creative director at various advertising agencies here. So I've been a creative director and art director from 1980 to 2012. And then from 2012 to now, I've been concentrating on researching advertising as an academic. In Canada, I went back in 2010 and I was working at Grey. And then in 2012, I decided to do my master's at Ryerson University and York University in Toronto. And I was focusing on racism and classism in Mexican advertising. And then I moved to Britain in 2015 to teach at the University of Westminster and to start my PhD in 2016 at the Royal College of Art, where I met Kirsty. And my theme now is on decolonizing advertising. So I moved to Mexico in 1993 to work as a creative director, art director, Grey Advertising. And then from 1995 to 2005, I was vice president, creative director of BBDO Mexico. And Bayer, which is the big sort of pharmaceutical company, was the largest client. And I was the creative director for that brand. And this is the story of how my three interests came together of advertising, art, and academia. And it's very weird because the three don't really go together, but I was able to make them work. And I'm going to talk first about my MA research, which was racism and classism in Mexican advertising. And I did that at Ryerson and York Universities in Toronto. And what I wanted to research, and my research question was, what are the visual representations of the power relationships in Mexico's political economy as reflected through the appropriation of advertising? So basically, what I wanted to do was just look at how advertising reflected race and power in Mexican advertising. So I started to look at the history of Mexico, and what I discovered is that the Aztecs were a very classist society. They were very hierarchical, with the king, the emperor at the top, and then the ruling class. Then you have the priests, the people with knowledge, and then you would have the general public, similar to sort of the way class is in Britain. But when the Spanish came, they introduced the concept of race. And I discovered 16 paintings in Mexico City in a Castillo de Chapultepec Castle. Chapultepec Castle was on, there's that TV show called Race Across the World. And in season 2 that was playing in spring, they started at Chapultepec Castle. And in that place, there were paintings that reflected the different races. And at the top were these Spanish people who were pure-blooded Spanish. They were reflected this way. And then there were 16 different classifications for the different races of how they intermarried and then what their children were. And here is a picture on the right-hand side of an indigenous person and a black person. And just look at how they're reflected. So this is an example of 2D imagery, which in this case is paintings, and how they represented races. Then I looked at the history of the ruling class in Mexico and discovered that the ruling class are basically Spanish-blooded or European people. There's one family. I looked at 3 families. This first family, they own Bimbo, which is the world's largest bread maker. And they also make crisps. They're the big competition for Walkers in Britain. And that was that family. And then there was another family which owns the beer companies in Mexico, and they sold to Heineken. But they are still on the board of directors of the Heineken company for Latin America. Then there is another family, and this family here owns luxury department stores and silver mines. And they own, Harrods. So this would be the Mexican version of Harrods, and it's called El Palacio de Hierro. And what I did is that once I discovered these 3 families, I looked at their advertising and their messages. And I looked at 5 things. I looked at the skin color that was represented in the advertising. I looked at the class, the social class. I looked at the gestures of the people in the advertising. I looked at the words that were written, the music, and I also looked at the gaze. The gaze, I mean by the position of the camera. So, for example, regarding race and skin color, I didn't want me to decide if a person was white or mixed-blooded or indigenous. So what I did, I based my research on the Fitzpatrick skin type scale, which is basically a scale that was produced by the Australian government that just looks at skin and the amount of pigment in it. So that's how I analyzed the people in the advertising, and I looked at their skin color. So it wasn't my prejudice or bias that was making decisions. And basically in Mexico, 10% of the people who live in Mexico are white or European blooded. Then 83% are mixed blooded, because Mexico is indigenous people, and then the Spanish came, and then the people mixed, and the majority of people in Mexico are mixed blooded, and then 7% are Amerindian, and 0.5% are Afro-Mexican. So those are people who came over from Africa, some through the slave trade, and others escaping America. So I looked at 3 TV commercials, and I looked at one TV commercial from the company called Bimbo, and they make a crisp product called Runners. Then I looked at an ad from Palacio de Hierro, which was the department store. Then I looked at the beer commercial, and I analyzed them with those 5 codes that I showed you. So I'm just going to show you the one commercial.
No, está apartado por un amigo.
Llegó toda la adrenalina de los nuevos Monster Runners. Nos gusta la adrenalina. Saborea el turbo queso.
What I did is that I broke down the actors into the commercial. And so male one was A, male B was B, and then C, and then D, and then the group of actors that were there. And then I created, then I told you about the different skin types. So type 1 always burns, never tans, to type 6, which never burns and is deeply pigmented dark brown. And what I concluded when I looked at the people in that commercial was that it was like 80% of the people in the commercial were in this area here, which is actors E, actors A, C, D, and E, and 4 of the background actors. So those are the people with very light skin. And so what I concluded was that the percentages of real Mexican society were not reflected in the TV commercial. And so I concluded that the commercial demonstrates that during a confrontation, the higher class has the power over the lower class, because the lower class would be the guy that was in the car that was sort of making fun of the 3 students. And then this was reinforced through the use of signs and cultural codes that emphasize differences in social economic status, skin type, gestures, artifacts, age difference, and music. Because in the music, the guy in the car who comes from the lower classes was playing traditional Mexican music, and the music that was identified with the younger people who were lighter skinned and from the upper classes was modern music, imported music, rock music. So those are all the different signs that were there. And basically, I concluded that Runners, which is the name of the product, creates a mythical story of struggle between the contemporary bourgeoisie, middle, and upper classes versus the traditional lower classes. And I did the same analysis for the Palacio de Hierro ad, which was the fashion department store, and for the beer ad. And I came to the same conclusion. And so when I analyzed those 3 commercials, I concluded that the cultural hegemony cultivated by the ruling families is unconsciously maintained through the messages that portray values which indirectly reinforce their class power. So basically what I'm saying is that the people of the ruling families who are come from European blood are unconsciously reflecting those stories that were in the paintings that I showed you that were like 400, 500 years old. And they reinforce those stories that the Spanish started broadcasting through paintings 500 years ago. And those cultural values that were created 500 years ago are now so ingrained into Mexican society that they are not questioned and are now part of the construction of modern Mexico. And the power representations of Mexico's political economy that are presented through advertising is the cultivated myth of the light-skinned ruling class. So basically, if you look at advertising in Mexico, even for crisps, I used to do Walker's advertising in Mexico for 10 years and Doritos and stuff like that. And you will see that even for crisps, they use light-skinned people. And they put them in positions of power in the commercials. They have them being the hero in the commercials. And all that does is reinforce this story of the sort of white power in Mexico. And then what I did is I do a thing called art through research. And I then decided, after I'd done my research, to express my research through art. So I wanted consumers to understand how products get linked to myths and how advertising normalizes some myths which might not be true. So I decided to work with artists who did not work in advertising agencies, because advertising in Mexico, you know, most of the global advertising agencies like we have around the world, whether they're in China, Africa, Europe, North America, South America, they are owned basically by Americans, by Europeans, and Japanese. And I went to the people in Mexico, in the towns, who actually create messages, because not every store can afford to hire an advertising agency. So there are people that offer their services. So I went to those people. I went to one guy called Don Nico, and what he does is he paints murals and paints signs on storefronts. And I went to a group of younger guys, and they had a company called Intralonas, and they would do it based on the computer. So I said to them, there are 3 brands, Palacio de Hierro, Tecate, and Runners, and I would like you to just paint your ad. I want you to use the logo, but the rest is up to you. So this is Don Nico, and he painted it on this type of material, and this was his ad for Palacio de Hierro, which I then took and then I placed it on regular advertising produced by the big agencies, and then I recorded it and I left it up there for a few days. Then for Runners, I went to those other guys, and they produced this image that you see here that I put in front of 7-Eleven. And then Don Nico did his version of Runners, and I put that in front of different stores around Mexico and recorded it. And then this was for the beer, Tecate beer. And I did that for 2 weeks, and I put those pieces up. It's called interventions. I did an intervention. So I took those messages done by those artists and put them up around Mexico City. And what I concluded by comparing the advertising done by the big agencies versus the advertising done by the people who live in the small villages was that what it showed me, that it demonstrated how the absence of casting and expensive narrative techniques seemed to create a situation where the rotolos, which are the names of the posters that they did, depended more on design and for the most part did not reflect the racism and classism of the more mainstream advertising. What is not included in the images created by the 2 artists called rotolistas is important, as they solved the communication problem by using visual design to construct the message. So, this is the Runners ad using people and reflecting these sort of attitudes in Mexico and placing these people eating the product, the target market, whereas the ads that were done by the rotolistas didn't include people and then featured mostly the product. Now, so that was my master's research, which I did in 2015 in Canada. Then I moved to Britain, and then I went to the Royal College of Art. And what I wanted to do is I had discovered why there was racism in Mexican advertising. So what I tried to do for my PhD was look for solutions. And I decided to decolonize advertising. And why this PhD project? Well, I had 9 years in Canada, then I moved in 93 to Mexico. And when I was working in Mexico, I didn't understand why the people I saw on the street were not reflected in the advertising. And that bothered me for 20 years as a creative director there. And of course, I would show people with darker skin as my recommendations for the castings. And the clients were the ones that would be picking the European or the Argentinian models. And the Argentinians mostly are European, coming from Italy or Spain. So they would come to Mexico and work, and they would get hired because of the way they look physically. And so that is why I was very interested. And the title of my project was called Decolonizing Advertising. But what is decolonizing? Well, decolonizing involves removing or rewriting rules and concepts left by colonial era thinking that still control or influence society. So you guys are in Britain right now, and I'm assuming most of you were born and bred in Britain. So Britain has its way of thinking and its ideology, and the English, conquered Scotland, Ireland, and Wales and brought their thinking into those countries. And that's why we have Britain now. And then England and Britain did that. And England and Britain went to Africa. They went to Asia and imposed their way of thinking, and India. So what decolonizing means is taking the British way of thinking and looking at those rules and saying, do we need this British way of thinking, or can we, say in the case of India, go back to our Indian way of thinking and our Indian laws and rules? And that's what decolonizing means. So I wanted to look at advertising and just see what are the rules in advertising, and why, are there rules in advertising in Mexico that allow for the most of the ads in Mexico to be filled with white people when white people are only 10% of the population. So in this research I'm doing now, I'm looking and I'm seeing that advertising is a form of colonizing. So it's a way of getting thinking out and ideologies to the consumers. And also I'm looking at how 2D advertising, because there's many different types of advertising, and for research you need to focus and narrow yourself down. So I'm looking at 2D, which is flat, printed stuff. And also there's secondary messages in advertising. So you'll have the main message, which is the client, what the client wants you to say, like Walker's crisps are crunchy, or Walker's crisps have the best taste. And then there's a secondary message, which I've just shown you in the runner's ad, which reflect the society and just the racial breakdown. And also my PhD research investigates how advertising messages are constructed, because what I did is I went and I looked at how 2D messages were created. So typography, images like illustrations or photography, the media that's placed, the colors that I used, things like that. So I wanted to register that in Mexico so I could understand it more. And then I'm looking at solutions to decolonize advertising. Of course, I cannot do it by myself. All I can do is make suggestions. So my research question for my PhD right now is, how can the application of decolonized tools and techniques resist the racist spectacle in Mexican advertising? So basically, remember I talked about how I was analyzing how 2D messages, advertising messages, are created in Mexico. And, printing, inks, materials like vinyl, or electronic billboards. Those are not the original tools that were used by the Aztecs. They created inks made out of insect bodies or from flowers, and they used feathers to paint. So they didn't use quills, the hard end. They would turn it around and use the actual feather part to paint. So I just wanted to look at maybe the tools are the reasons why there's racism in Mexican advertising. I don't know. I'm still looking at that. And then I had other questions like, why in Mexico are the majority of people on the street not reflected in advertising? And what are the tools and techniques used by advertising to create 2D messaging? And my objectives of my research were to analyze and understand the functions and systems that allow racism and class to exist in Mexico. The second one was to deconstruct how 2D messaging is created through advertising tools and techniques and map the media landscape. So here I have pictures of the areas where I went, and I took pictures of everything that was used to advertising. This is advertising. It's done by a farmer, that's trying to sell his cherries. And then this is done by a company that's trying to sell car repair. And also I wanted to understand how meaning is constructed by where people don't realize the messages that they're getting. They will understand that an ad says crisps are crunchy, but they may not understand that the ad is also reinforcing the racial ideas that I just talked about. Now, my definition of advertising is this. Advertising is a designed communication that reinterprets signs and symbols in order to persuade. So I'm an art director. I work with photographers, illustrators, photographers, actors to get across messaging for brands. And what I see is that when I construct an ad, what I do is I look at the target market or the people I'm trying to speak to, and then I try to relate to them. So it could be, if I'm talking to people who are 18 years of age, I'll look at their hairstyles, the type of clothing they're wearing, the words they use, the clothing, the jewelry, what other things are they using, like type of phones and where they live, and I will put that into the advertising. So that's what I mean by reinterpreting signs and symbols, because I'll be deciding which of these signs and things that relate to young people and music do I need to put in the ad in order to get my message across. So the methods and methodologies that I used: I do art through research. And what art through research is, it investigates a question through theory. So like I showed you for that, when I was looking at racism in the advertising, there were theories I looked at for racism. And then once I understand why that happened and I came to those conclusions that I did, I then do a visual expression, which is what I showed you, where I went to local artisans and then worked with them. And then what I do is, once I've put that expression out there, what I do is I analyze social media to see what people are saying about the interventions of my art. So it's 3 phases that I do, and I'm doing those 3 phases for this PhD. And I'm just going to take them for you now. So yeah, I just already told you that. So the theories. So the theories that I looked at is, I looked at racism and classism in Mexico. There are quite a few people writing about it, so I read their work. And I wrote about that. Then I looked at the history of advertising in Mexico and analyzed people's academic papers who wrote about that. And then I looked at this idea of colonialism and what is colonialism, and then what does decolonizing mean. And I looked at people who were talking about that in the academic world. And then I sort of wrote my paper and put those theories together, and then came up with my own sort of interpretation of it. And then I expressed that through artwork, which I'm just going to take you through now. So first of all, I did some, once I did the sort of research into theory, I went on the streets of Mexico in 3 areas. So I went to a poor area, I went to a middle class area, and then I went to a rich area. And I took pictures within a 4-block radius of all the advertising that I saw. And that was my data collection. So and for me, this is an ad, this is an ad, this is an ad, this is an ad, right? This poster on a street lamp post is an ad. Even these stickers that Mexicans were putting on street signs, I took pictures of and analyzed. So I analyzed everything that was 2D messaging, because remember, I told you what my definition of advertising is. So advertising is not just what you think of a picture of a person drinking something. It could be a sticker, because they are advertising and getting across a thought. Graffiti, for me, is a form of advertising. And then I mapped them all, and I put them on Google Maps. And I was able on Google Maps to tag exactly where I got the ad from. So, here, you can do this. I can give you the link later, but you can click on this, and then up will come the picture of the ad. And then I just wrote down who the client was, the size of the ad, and then what was the material that the ad was made of. And I did that for all the ads in the 4-block radius in each of those 3 areas that I did. And I did 800 ads in total. And I used Navivo, which was the software, to then also register. So I did it on Google Docs to say where the location was, and then I inputted that into a software called Navivo. And then I wrote definitions. What is typography? And then I used academic research to get the definitions. It wasn't my definitions, it was definitions from other people to construct my dictionary of what is typography, what does material mean, what does dominant color mean, what does medium mean, what does layout mean, etc. Then for the visual part, so I just told you the phase one, which was me looking at the theory of race, colonization, and advertising. And then I also analyzed the tools and techniques. For phase two, which I'm in now, what I'm looking at is decolonizing tools. So I'm looking at the tools that the Aztecs use, because I've already analyzed the tools that the contemporary world's using now in Mexico. And what I'm going to be doing is a campaign. So I'm going to be creating murals, posters, inspired by a theory called situationism, which came from France de Tournemont, where they would take images from society and then redo them and then put them out. And it was done in the 60s in France, and it was part of the student revolution, where the French students went against the French government. And then this is an example of what I would do of murals. I would do murals that would say things like, "We cannot be erased." And that would be done in Nahuatl, which is the indigenous language, and then Spanish. Then part of my idea, and I'm dealing with this, is doing graffiti, where I would actually go on advertising that exists right now from places like Palacio de Hierro, which I already showed you, focuses just on white people in their advertising, and I would replace them. Here, you will know this woman. She was in the movie called Roma that was on Netflix. And so what I would do is sort of replace the white model and replace it with an indigenous woman. And again, that was based on theories that I found out from the 1960s, where this artist would take traditional paintings and then paint over them. And then I would also do my reinterpretation of, remember I told you that the Spanish were doing these paintings that showed different races together and how their families would look. So I would do contemporary versions of that, showing how contemporary Mexican society is. And this is of, here is of a Mexican woman who married an American, and together they have a child called a cholo. And these people live in the USA. Then I would do scenes of stories of Mexico as if it had not been colonized. So I would be doing, and I'm working on this right now, on stories of Mexico if the Spanish hadn't came. What would Mexico be like, and how would Mexicans communicate? And then the other idea is working with indigenous peoples to create messaging on what they think Gucci should be done, or how Tiffany's, the jewelry company, how would they advertise? And then, like I said, what I would do, what I'm going to be doing is, once I've created this artwork and having it out in the streets of Mexico, I will be analyzing social media conversation. And that will be talking with Mexicans who obviously have money to have phones and are on social media, but Mexico is not all capitalist, and not everybody has social media. So there are people who don't have any of that. So I would go on the streets and then interview them. And of course, I would go with people who spoke Nahuatl, so that I would get that information. I've done this before. So what I do right now is I'm publishing my research online in the form of news articles, and then people respond in Mexico to what I've done. So here I did an article about my master's research, and then people were saying things like, and yet the clients keep asking the creatives to change the person for a wider one. So who's to blame, the advertisers or the clients? The colonizers, some of those clients and creatives are mixed and are not white at all, but they are so mentally colonized that they hate their own color, culture, and origins. So those are the types of conversations that happen. And because I don't want me imposing on Mexicans my way, because that will be a colonizing way of thinking, right? So what I'm doing is putting ideas out into mass media and then having Mexicans discussing that and coming up with their own solutions. And then the semi-structured street interviews, like I said. So when I do the murals, then I would go to the Mexicans. Well, I would be with an interpreter, and then they would speak to them in Nahuatl, which is the indigenous language, to get their interpretation of the messaging that would be in the murals. I use a typical technique that I do is that I do my artwork, whether it's on billboards, whether it's murals, whether it's TV commercials, and I do it to get conversation. And so that's what I'm doing there. But like I just said, how can I decolonize Western tools as a Westerner? And I can't do that because, you know, I come from a culture that historically is a colonizer. And I can't be a white savior either. I can't be this white person coming in and trying to save the indigenous peoples. So, and also I cannot create messaging on behalf of indigenous peoples. So I need to go, so what I'm doing is I'm going to the indigenous peoples and having them create messages. I'm going to show you now something I did in October, where I went to a town in Mexico and I went with them, and they and I worked with them so that they would create messaging. So I'm just going to take you on that journey. And this is towards the end of my project now because I know we're at 10:39. So I went to this cultural center in the town of Iguala in Mexico. And I then worked with them. And these are the people from the cultural center who worked with me. And as you can see, they look sort of stereotypical Mexican. And they liked my idea, and they produced this invitation for a workshop. And they asked people who spoke Nahuatl, which is the indigenous language in Spanish, to come at a certain time to the cultural center to work with me on this idea of colonialism and discrimination. And this is a picture of the cultural center. Of course, it's during COVID, so we all wore masks. We had the windows open. And my whole workshop was broadcast live on Facebook so that other people could participate. And what I did is I did it in 4 phases. So the beginning, I spoke to them about the tools and techniques, and I said, what tools do artists use now in your towns and in your villages? And then we did that. Then I asked them, what tools and techniques did your people use before the Spanish came? So I was able to find out what was done then to create messaging. So I wrote those down. That's me there. Then for the second exercise, I then was talking about the proudness of being Mexican. And I wanted to sort of see what they felt about being Mexican and what was the history and how proud they felt about their country and about the history of their country. So I asked them these questions. If the Spanish had not come to Mexico, what would be your typical favorite drink, for example? And then I asked them to express visually on pieces of paper or with words how they would express and support their culture visually, whether they were Afro-Mexicans, whether they're indigenous people, or they were mixed-blooded Mexicans. And if they were if Mexico had conquered Europe, what would the ads look like in Europe, for example? And then they did that on pieces of paper. So I'm working with the local communities. There were people who were teachers, there were people who had PhDs, these were all indigenous, or there were people who were artisans. Then for the third exercise, I talked about advertising in Mexico, and we looked at ads in Mexico, and then asked questions. Why were there not people with darker skin in the ads? And things like that. And then I asked them to create ads for by the bread company Bimbo, and how would you do an ad for this bread company if the people were Afro-Mexican or indigenous? Or what would Coca-Cola do if Coca-Cola did ads that didn't have white people, and it talked about the great food that Mexico had, that was not imported? So not hamburgers, not sandwiches, but your local food. How would the ad look? So I asked them to sort of create that, and then they worked on that. So this is an example of me working with the community. And then for the fourth exercise, I asked them what was missing in advertising. And what, if you were doing advertising for a store of luxury clothing, how would it look? And then I asked them also to write phrases in Nahuatl, which is their native language, reflecting those ideas as well. And remember, I work as a creative director, so I was bringing sort of the way we do brainstorming in advertising to the local community. And the people, like, I didn't want complicated ads. I just wanted ideas. So basically, they generated 80 ads. And then at the end, the Cultural Center created this certificate and gave it to each of the people that participated to say that they participated in this workshop on discrimination and colonialism. These are the participants. And so what I had to keep in mind when I was working on my campaign was not to be a white savior and not to create messages on behalf of the indigenous people, and not me saying what they wanted to say. It needed to come from them. So I was trying to create a situation where I could make people feel comfortable, set the situation up, but not put words in their mouth, and just sort of inspire them, and then they would create the messaging. So what I've just shown you is how I worked with two communities, one in Mexico City and one in the town of Iguala, in order for me to decolonize advertising. And what I did was, it was local community participating in the decision making. I just set the situation up, and then whatever they created, I would broadcast. So it wasn't my ideas or my work, and I wasn't telling them how to work. I gave them paper and pens, but it was up to them to put whatever they wanted on the paper and pens, and it was their voice, not mine. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much, Plymouth College of Art. It was a great pleasure speaking to you guys. So do you have any questions?
Oh my God, Carl, I could just ask you so many questions on that presentation. That was amazing. Thank you so much. I mean, really, honestly, thank you. That even makes me think about kind of the advertising that we see on a day-to-day basis in the fashion industry, and the lack. We talk about this all the time, about the lack of diversity that exists in the fashion industry, and how models are usually from very specific areas of the world. And at the moment, that's either Europe or China is obviously an increasing kind of dominant face that we're starting to see. But yeah, just amazing. Guys, if anybody has got any, oh look, so inspiring was the first comment. If anybody's got any comments, please do feel free to ask questions in the chat box. Carl, I wondered if I could kickstart off by asking you about how important it was for you to actually be in the physical space when you're doing this research. Because a lot of our students sit, and a lot of the research they're gathering is research that's been done by other people. Yeah. So they work with, I'm sure you know the platform WGSN and LSN. No. You might not actually, because it's not. But these are two platforms where you've got the industry generating reports on a daily basis about the fashion industry. But all your work is situated, and I just wonder how important you feel being situated in a community is, and what value that brings to your research.
I totally understand what you're saying. I mean, during COVID, people are limited also in doing physical research and being together. And that was a big issue for me. But I just felt using technology is a way of colonizing, and trying to deal with people who are indigenous who may not have a computer or know about Zoom and things like that. And it was important for me to get their voice. So I had to go to the community. There was no other way of me doing it. So that was why I ended up doing it, going there. It was very nerve-wracking for me because I had to go in by bus. It was too expensive to rent a car, and rent-a-cars wouldn't give me a car to go to the area I was going, actually, because it was a town called Iguala, where 43 students were murdered. I think it was 5 years ago. You guys would have seen it in the news. The whole world went there because they couldn't understand how 43 students could be taken, murdered, and nobody knew who killed them. Was it the government? Was it the local cartel? Was it the mayor? Was it local gangs? They still don't know. So anyway, it was difficult for me to get there, but I eventually got there. And then working with the people sorry, can you just, sorry, I know I'm sort of blabbering on. Can you just go back to your exact question again, Kirsty, so I can make sure I answer it?
So I'm really interested in the fact that you are using you're collecting primary data by going to the source. You're not relying on secondary data. And I just wonder, especially for the students, because they rely a lot on secondary data, how much that information brings value to your research. So how much value is primary data bringing to your research?
In this case, I needed it because I needed to go right to the original source, which were the indigenous people. So the primary research of going physically and recording it and having that as evidence for me was important. And then that was supported by then me researching through theory, which is I still need that because that helps set up what I do and informs me before I actually did my primary research there in Iguala. So it's a combination of both in my case.
Fantastic, thank you. I mean, all the comments that are coming in is just that you've inspired so many people. The students are feeling really inspired and they feel like they've learned a lot just from your talk, just from 50 minutes of conversation. They feel like they've learned a lot. So that's really lovely feedback. Has anybody got any questions? I'm thinking about third years in relation to your third year projects and diversity and working with communities. This is what Carl is actually doing at the moment. We might have some great advice about kind of, I know one of the students, she is on here, but she might be a little scared to kind of speak up. But one of the things that she's really concerned about and worried about is how you reach out to communities, especially as a young student, to try and engage with them so that they feel invested in your project. Have you got any advice on how you reach out to participants to engage so that they feel invested in wanting to work with you?
Yeah, I think it's important not just to be taking as a researcher. You also need to give, because if you just go and it's like, give me this and I want to do this and it's for me and my research, I think it's not a great invitation for people necessarily to participate. So I think you also need to think about what is the benefit for them. And for the people that I went to, they were very interested, first of all, in the theme of colonization and discrimination. So they don't have opportunities to talk about that where they are. So that was the benefit for them, is the conversation and being around like-minded people. So all my point is that if you're trying to sort of get information from a group, you also need not just to be selfish and think about yourself, you also need to think about how they can benefit. And then if you can position it in a way that they can benefit, I think then you're more likely to get people to participate, That would be my advice.
I think that's absolutely the soundest advice that you can give any student. One question that's coming is, how would you recommend to start these conversations with communities of people? How do you open up the dialogue in the first place?
Good question, Molly. My advice, what I do is I believe in influencers, influencers on Instagram, how they work. Influencers are people that other people look up to. So what I did is in Mexico City, I went to artists that I look up to and talked to them about sort of my research and what I was looking for. And they were the ones that helped put me in contact with this community in Iguala. So that's one way, is sort of going to the leaders of opinion and the people who have the control or the power. I think that's an important thing, or people that are knowledgeable in that area. Uh, Another thing is, where are those people? So sometimes people are on Twitter, so you can do DMs, direct messaging to people on Twitter, or you could find out where they congregate. Maybe they meet in a coffee shop, so you could try something like that. Or you could, like on LinkedIn. So on LinkedIn, there are people who I follow in advertising who post things about ads. And I follow those people, and then I will make comments, and I try to build a relationship that way. So there are different ways of reaching these conversations, but one is through social media. Another one is, where are those people physically, or find out people who have an interest in that subject you're researching and start conversations with them, again, through social media, or going to meet them physically, or get introduced by maybe a third party through a friend of a friend.
Again, such great advice, Carl. You know, that we say about these what is it, the 6 degrees of separation. The chances are that you will probably know somebody they know if you kind of work through the process. So Natalie's just asking the question where she says, what do you want the outcome to be from creating these campaigns, murals, posters? Are you hoping it starts a wider conversation about the lack of authentic representation within advertising?
Great question, Natalie. Yes, definitely. But I don't, like I was trying to say, Carl Jones is not going to decolonize advertising. It's an interest I have. All I can do is, I think, start a conversation. And that's what I do, these murals and these news articles, is because people, like I said, it was so ingrained in Mexico, people never questioned it. It was only me. And then my staff, the creative people I worked with, began to understand what I meant. So I think the solution needs to come from Mexicans within Mexico. And I just want people to talk about it and be aware, and then decide for themselves, do they want to decolonize advertising or not? It's their decision. I've already got Mexicans talking about race and representation, which is terrific. Now I want Mexicans to sort of look for solutions, because it is a problem. Mexicans are talking about it. It's in the news. I've been interviewed on many different channels, on social media, podcasts and stuff. So yes, problem. So how do we solve it? And again, it needs to come from them. But that's sort of what the outcome I want is, people talking, and hopefully them coming up with solutions.
Oh, they're coming in thick and fast now, Carl. Alicia's saying, where we are in the southwest of England, it's very white and European, and that is very true. So when they're trying to cast models who aren't from this background, it really does prove very difficult for our students to kind of have this representation. And however, when trying to be inclusive and diverse in model casting with different races and backgrounds, do you have any advice on how to get around this problem when you don't have a pool of people to kind of it's very difficult in the southwest?
Yes,
I'd say.
I totally agree with you, Alice. Now, what I would do if I was in your situation, I don't know whether, in the thick of COVID, when the lockdown happened on March 23rd, I started researching and looking at how people were doing advertising. People were shooting commercials. People were taking pictures for print ads and stuff. Things were being done. What I discovered was that people were using Zoom. Like, I think there was a fashion shoot for Vogue where they did it, like the model was in her home, the clothes were sent to her, and then the makeup artist was on Zoom guiding her on how to do the makeup and her hair. And then the photographer was taking screenshots and then telling the model where to place the desktop or her phone to take the pictures. So my point is that if those people of different backgrounds and different races are not there, then maybe you can visit them digitally and use Zoom or whatever soft or this Google thing, just and directing them and having them and asking them to pose and place the camera so you can get the types of images that you want. You don't fight it, just embrace it and research that, what I just told you about Vogue. I don't have the link, but I'm sure if you Google Vogue and using taking fashion shoots during COVID, you will find information around that. But that was what my advice would be.
I almost think that thinking outside of the box has been one of the best things to come out of COVID. We've all had to really think outside of the box and really develop our ideas beyond what is classed as normal or normalized. I saw there was a great campaign with Nick Knight's Show Studios. I think it was one of the Hadid sisters, I can't remember, but he got her to photograph herself 360 degrees on a mobile phone. And then, yes, that's the one. And then they just kind of used programming to program the images on top of it. And it was just phenomenal. It just showed what is so capable in these really kind of bizarre times that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that link. That was what I was talking about. That's terrific, Alana.
This is Alana who works with me. She does she does a lot of our kind of cultural delivery on the course. Phenomenal. Thank you so much for coming in from Mexico. I honestly believe these guys are going to go away and they're really going to think about the message in the campaigns that they're planning right now, or the photo shoots that they're planning, or thinking about how they want to represent people. We've got some amazing projects happening where people are going back to their own communities to kind of shoot some campaigns. And I just think it's going to really make them think about how to really analyze what it is that they want to do with their projects.